We believe that African nations must end all reliance on foreign aid in order to unleash the continent's productive resources and energies. For Africa, the only way out of poverty and underdevelopment is through the acquisition and generation of wealth and income. By taking the focus off charity and aid, we envision a path where world leaders, policymakers, academics, and talented people all around shift attention and in turn the conversation to business and trade as levers for development. Foreign aid, as we know it today, where governments across the rich world transfer taxpayer resources and support to poorer developing countries in the form of grants, the provision of machinery and medicines, equipment, foreign expertise, and soft loans, was popularized by former World Bank head Robert McNamara throughout the 1960s and 1970s. A former military officer who served as president for the Ford Motor Company, he was quickly called on by the new Kennedy administration and appointed to the position of Secretary of Defense. In 1968, McNamara took on the role of president of the World Bank, leading the multilateral bank for 13 years. Under his tenure, the institution oversaw a rapid transformation and expansion of its mandate, and we began to see the beginnings of the World Bank as we understand it today. But not only that, other international bodies such as the International Monetary Fund and the United Nations Development Programme also followed from the World Bank's lead. World Bank financial support to the world grew more than 10 times over by the end of his time as president. The Global South absorbed a lot of this growth, as stated in his historic Nairobi address in 1973. McNamara viewed the dominant model and scope of official development assistance as, quote, inadequate, unquote, for developing regions in urgent need of reform. At the time, the world was still operating in the shadows and ruins of the Second World War and the chaos of the swinging 60s. US financial assistance and technical support by means of the Marshall Plan helped rebuild Europe and the Far East. Southern Hemisphere nations, including those of Africa, had embraced the creed of nationalism that took hold of Europe in the first half of the century, opting to take their destiny into their own hands as self-determined, independent entities. With that said, the Global South had no real economic engine and developmental infrastructure for delivering sustainable development. In 1970, China and India, for example, had economies that were about the size of that of Italy and Canada, respectively, a far cry from the economic behemoths we know them as today. McNamara recognized that global institutional players, like the World Bank, would have to play a more prominent role in facilitating growth and building efforts for the economies and societies of Africa, parts of Asia, and Latin America. The interconnectedness, networks, and foundation simply did not exist for the global private sector to efficiently allocate and deploy resources and drive growth for the Third World, as it was referred to back then. However, what might have made sense more than 50 years ago is no longer applicable today. It is estimated that the global community has sent over $2.5 trillion in aid to Africa since 1960. Yet the income gap between the continent and the rest of the Global South has only widened since then. Indeed, industrially and economically, Africa was at its strongest when it was a lot less reliant on aid, leading more and more of us to question the overall value and efficacy of aid as an instrument for economic and human development. In fact, as the Trump administration is dismantling US aid before our very eyes, and another big donor in my country, Great Britain, announces its plans to reduce its foreign aid commitments, more of us seem to be coming to terms with the reality that aid cannot make poor countries rich, as recently declared by The Economist magazine. New innovative tools and mechanisms for delivering development to poorer countries will now have to be considered. When McNamara stepped down from the World Bank in 1981, an evolving zeitgeist was emerging around the world. The United Kingdom and the United States introduced what would go on to be known as Thatcherism and Reaganomics. These were part of the wider neoliberal framework that posited that the economy should be spearheaded by market forces and engaged by private entrepreneurs who can trade freely with others around the world. The state-led initiatives and centralized planning that came to define the post-war decades had no place in this doctrine. What followed was a near wholesale embrace of capitalism and free markets, and the rejection of communism the world over. Financial deregulation and government privatization campaigns set off a boom in global stock markets and banking, while India and China finally reformed their heavily centralized economies to prioritize the needs of the private sector more, with them going on to reclaim their internationally renowned roles as economic giants. In 2025, the Global South, Africa in particular, has a much wider variety of financial platforms and mechanisms available to it than in decades past. If an African nation wants to secure funding to build a hydroelectric dam or construct a hospital, it can tap into the multi-trillion-dollar euro-dollar markets for bonds. Or they can issue their own diaspora bonds, as nations such as Nigeria and Ethiopia are already doing. If an African nation wants to expand its tech sector, it can do so by luring investment dollars and capital from large foreign corporations and their smaller counterparts. It can also choose to float the shares of local industry players on homegrown stock exchanges as a means of expanding the investment pool. The option of approaching a development organization for industrial support and assistance in the form of cheap loans and grants that can be timely to implement and come with conditionalities is increasingly seen as passé and archaic in today's day and age. It's time for Africa to completely unburden itself of foreign aid, the last vestige of a bygone era.